In 1971, a 20-year-old American soldier vanished without a trace in the dense jungles of Vietnam. But 31 years later, a discovery at a suburban yard sale would unearth secrets that had been buried for decades and reveal a truth so shocking it would shatter everything his family thought they knew about his disappearance. The morning James Morrison stepped out of his pickup truck onto the cracked driveway of the modest ranch house in Sacramento, he had no idea he was about to stumble upon the most significant piece of evidence in a case that had haunted the military for over 3 decades. It was a typical Saturday in September 2002, the kind of crisp autumn day that brought out bargain hunters and treasure seekers to the countless yard sales that dotted the suburban landscape. James, a retired construction foreman with an eye for tools and military surplus, had been making the rounds since dawn, searching through boxes of forgotten memories and discarded belongings that told the stories of lives lived and chapters closed. The elderly woman conducting the sale, Mrs. Dorothy Kessler, sat in a folding chair beneath a weathered umbrella, her arthritis-gnarled hands counting crumpled bills as customers picked through tables laden with household items, books yellowed with age, and military memorabilia that spoke of a time when young men went to war, and some never came home. It was among this collection of artifacts from a distant conflict that James's attention was drawn to a dented steel helmet, its olive drab paint chipped and faded, bearing the unmistakable scratches and wear of combat. But it wasn't the helmet's battle-worn appearance that stopped James in his tracks. Scrawled across the front in faded black marker, barely legible after 3 decades, were 4 words that would change everything. Make war, not love. The ironic twist on the famous peace slogan of the era sent a chill down James's spine, not because of its provocative message, but because those words, that distinctive handwriting, belonged to someone he had been searching for his entire adult life. James's hands trembled as he lifted the helmet, turning it over to examine the interior, where he found what he had hoped and feared he would discover. There, stamped into the leather headband, was a name and service number that matched the information he had memorized from decades of correspondence with military officials, private investigators, and anyone who might have information about his missing brother, Private First Class Robert Morrison, service number deleted for privacy, 1st Infantry Division, reported missing in action during Operation Cedar Falls in January 1971. The discovery sent James's mind reeling back 31 years to the day when 2 uniformed officers had appeared at his parents' door, their solemn expressions and carefully rehearsed words delivering news that would fracture his family forever. Robert, just 20 years old and barely 6 months into his tour of duty, had disappeared during a routine patrol near the Cambodian border. His unit had been sweeping through dense jungle when they came under heavy fire from North Vietnamese forces. In the chaos of the firefight, Robert had become separated from his squad, and despite extensive search efforts, no trace of him was ever found. For James's parents, blue-collar workers from a steel town in Pennsylvania who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities beyond the factory floor, Robert's disappearance represented not just the loss of their youngest son, but the shattering of their faith in the promises America made to its young men. They had watched with pride as Robert excelled in high school, earned recognition for his athletic abilities, and seemed destined for the kind of success they had envisioned when they encouraged both their sons to reach beyond the limitations of their working-class background. But the war had intervened, as it had for so many young men of his generation, and their bright, promising boy had vanished into the green hell of Southeast Asia. The years that followed Robert's disappearance had been marked by a relentless search for answers. James's father had spent his life savings hiring private investigators, traveling to Washington, D.C. to meet with military officials, and even making 2 trips to Vietnam in the 1990s after diplomatic relations were restored. hoping to find some trace of his missing son. James's mother had aged rapidly in those years, her hair turning white seemingly overnight, her once vibrant spirit crushed by the weight of not knowing whether her child was alive or dead, whether he was suffering in some remote prison camp, or had died alone in the jungle. James himself had dedicated much of his adult life to the search, joining organizations for families of missing servicemen, maintaining correspondence with the Department of Defense's Prisoner of War Missing Personnel office, and following up on every lead, no matter how tenuous or unlikely. Despite his lack of formal education, he had learned to navigate the bureaucratic maze of military records, had mastered the language of casualty reports and intelligence summaries, and had become an expert on the complex politics of prisoner, repatriation, and remains recovery that characterized the long aftermath of the Vietnam conflict. But as the years passed and leads dried up, even James had begun to accept the likelihood that Robert was gone, that he had died in the jungle, and his remains would never be recovered. He had watched his parents grow old and pass away without ever learning the truth about their son's fate, and he had slowly begun to focus on his own life, his construction business, and the possibility that some mysteries were destined to remain unsolved. The helmet sitting in his trembling hands represented the first tangible evidence of Robert's fate that he had encountered in 3 decades. Mrs. Kessler, noticing James's obvious distress, approached with a concerned expression. James explained. In halting sentences punctuated by emotions, he struggled to contain that the helmet had belonged to his brother, a soldier who had disappeared in Vietnam more than 30 years earlier. The elderly woman's eyes widened with recognition and sympathy as she shared what little she knew about the helmet's provenance. Her late husband, she explained, had been a veteran of the Korean conflict who had developed a passion for collecting military memorabilia in his retirement years. He had purchased the helmet at an estate sale in San Francisco sometime in the mid-1980s, where it had been part of a larger collection belonging to a deceased veteran. The revelation that the helmet had been in civilian hands for nearly 2 decades raised immediate questions about how it had made its way from the jungles of Vietnam to a collector's display case in California. James purchased the helmet without hesitation, paying Mrs. Kessler's asking price of $25 for what was arguably the most valuable artifact in his brother's case. But even as he carefully placed the helmet in his truck, wrapping it in an old work shirt like a precious relic, James knew that this discovery was just the beginning of a new phase in his decades-long search for answers. His first step was to contact the Department of Defense's Prisoner of War Missing Personnel office, the same bureaucratic entity that had sent his family form letters and inconclusive reports for 30 years. James explained his discovery to a case officer who seemed genuinely intrigued by the development, though he cautioned him against expecting immediate answers. The helmet would need to be authenticated, he explained, and even if it proved genuine, its appearance at a civilian yard sale didn't necessarily provide new information about Robert's fate or the circumstances of his disappearance, but James was determined to pursue every possible lead, and he began his own investigation into the helmet's journey from Vietnam to Sacramento. He contacted Mrs. Kessler again, asking for any additional information about her husband's collecting activities, and learned that he had kept meticulous records of his purchases, including receipts, photographs, and correspondence with dealers and other collectors. Mrs. Kessler graciously allowed James to examine these records, and together they traced the helmet's provenance back to the 1984 estate sale in San Francisco. The estate had belonged to a man named Thomas Weaver, a Vietnamese veteran who had served with the 1st Infantry Division during the same time period as Robert. Weaver had died of cancer in 1984, and his widow had sold his extensive collection of military artifacts to settle his debts and clear out their home. The records showed that the helmet had been just one item among hundreds, part of a collection that Weaver had assembled over many years of trading and purchasing items from fellow veterans. and military surplus dealers. This connection to another veteran from Robert's division represented the first concrete lead James had encountered in decades, and he threw himself into researching Thomas Weaver's military service with the same determination that had sustained his search for 30 years. He obtained Weaver's military records through the National Archives, studied his unit's movements and operations during his tour of duty, and slowly began to piece together a picture of a man whose path had somehow intersected with his brother's in ways that were not immediately apparent. Weaver had served as a radio operator with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, the same unit that Robert had been assigned to when he disappeared. The two men had overlapping service dates and had been present during the same operations, including the fateful patrol during which Robert had gone missing. James realized that Weaver might have been one of the last people to see his brother alive, and he began searching for surviving members of their unit who might be able to provide additional information about both men and the circumstances of Robert's disappearance. Through veteran organizations and online forums, James slowly compiled a list of men who had served with Charlie Company during the relevant time period. Many had died in the intervening decades, victims of combat, Agent Orange exposure, or the various ailments that claimed Vietnam veterans at disproportionate rates. Others had simply disappeared into civilian life, choosing to leave their military service behind and avoid contact with reminders of their time in Southeast Asia. But James was persistent, and he gradually began making contact with survivors who remembered both Robert and Thomas Weaver. The picture that emerged from these conversations was troubling and complex. Robert was remembered as a capable soldier who had adapted well to the harsh realities of jungle warfare, but who had also displayed signs of the psychological strain that affected many young men thrust into the brutal environment of Vietnam. Several veterans recalled his habit of writing cryptic messages on his helmet and equipment, philosophical observations and dark humor that reflected his struggle to reconcile his idealistic worldview with the violence he witnessed daily. The phrase, "make war not love," was remembered by several of his fellow soldiers as being characteristic of Robert's increasingly cynical outlook as his tour progressed. Unlike many of his contemporaries who clung to peace symbols and anti-war sentiments, Robert had embraced a kind of fatalistic acceptance of his role as a warrior, adopting an attitude that seemed to suggest he had abandoned hope for anything. Beyond the immediate realities of survival and combat, Thomas Weaver was remembered quite differently by his surviving comrades. Where Robert had been introspective and philosophical, Weaver was described as opportunistic and pragmatic, a soldier who had learned to navigate the chaos of war by focusing on personal advantage and survival at any cost. Several veterans recalled incidents in which Weaver had been suspected of appropriating equipment and personal effects from fallen soldiers, though these accusations had never been formally investigated or proven. The emerging picture of Weaver as someone who might have scavenged battlefield souvenirs raised disturbing questions about how he had come to possess Robert's helmet. James began to consider scenarios that he had never allowed himself to contemplate during the decades when Robert's fate remained a complete mystery. Had Weaver found the helmet at the site where Robert had fallen? Had he removed it from Robert's body or from the scene of his death? The possibility that Robert's remains might still be lying undiscovered in some remote jungle location while his helmet sat in a collector's display case filled James with a combination of rage and desperate hope. His investigation took on new urgency as he realized that many of the veterans who possessed first-hand knowledge of the events surrounding Robert's disappearance were aging and dying, taking their memories and secrets with them to the grave. He began conducting extended interviews with surviving members of Charlie Company, recording their recollections and piecing together a more detailed picture of the unit's operations during the critical period in early 1971. Through these conversations, James learned that the patrol during which Robert had disappeared had been more complex and controversial than the official reports had indicated. Rather than a routine sweep operation, Charlie Company had been involved in a classified mission to investigate reports of North Vietnamese supply caches hidden in supposedly neutral territory. The mission had been conducted without proper authorization from higher command, and when it had gone badly wrong, resulting in multiple casualties and Robert's disappearance, there had been a deliberate effort to downplay its significance and classify its details to avoid political complications. The revelation that Robert's disappearance had occurred during an unauthorized mission that had been subsequently covered up added new dimensions to James's understanding of why his family's decades-long search for answers had been so frustrating and unproductive. Military officials had not been evasive and unhelpful out of simple bureaucratic indifference, but because they had been protecting classified information about operations that should never have occurred in the first place. James's breakthrough came during a conversation with Daniel Rodriguez, a former machine gunner who had been wounded during the same patrol that claimed Robert. Rodriguez had been evacuated to a military hospital in Japan, where he had spent several months recovering from his injuries, and he had never been debriefed about the specific details of the mission. As a result, he had preserved memories and observations that might have been suppressed or classified if he had remained with his unit. Rodriguez remembered the patrol in vivid detail, including the moment when Robert had become separated from the main group during a chaotic firefight in dense jungle. But he also remembered something that had never appeared in any official report. Thomas Weaver had been part of a small team that had returned to the contact site the following day to search for Robert and recover any equipment or intelligence materials that might have been left behind. Weaver had returned from that mission with several items that he claimed to have found scattered around the battlefield, including what Rodriguez now realized must have been Robert's helmet. The discovery that Weaver had deliberately returned to retrieve items from the site where Robert had disappeared cast his possession of the helmet in an entirely different light. Rather than simply stumbling upon it during the heat of battle, Weaver had made a calculated decision to search the area and remove personal effects that might have provided clues to Robert's fate. Rodriguez's recollections suggested that Weaver had found evidence of what had happened to Robert, but had chosen to keep that information to himself rather than report it to his superiors. Armed with this new information, James contacted military investigators and demanded that they reopen Robert's case and investigate the circumstances surrounding Weaver's recovery of the helmet. But he quickly discovered that the military bureaucracy that had frustrated his family for decades was even more resistant to admitting that their original investigation had been incomplete or compromised. Officials acknowledged that the helmet appeared to be authentic and that its recovery represented a significant development. But they maintained that the passage of 3 decades had made it impossible to conduct a meaningful investigation into the circumstances of its acquisition. James realized that if he wanted answers about his brother's fate, he would have to continue his investigation independently, following leads and pursuing information that military officials were either unable or unwilling to develop. He began researching Thomas Weaver's life after his return from Vietnam, looking for clues about what he might have known about Robert's disappearance and whether he had left any record of his knowledge. Weaver had settled in San Francisco after his discharge, where he had worked as a mechanic and part-time security guard while building his collection of military memorabilia. He had never married, had maintained few close relationships, and had lived a relatively solitary existence until his death from lung cancer in 1984. James's investigation into his personal effects and correspondence revealed a man who had been haunted by his wartime experiences, though whether his troubles stemmed from guilt over his actions or simply from the general trauma of combat remained unclear. The breakthrough James had been hoping for came from an unexpected source: Weaver's former neighbor, an elderly woman named Rosa Martinez, who had lived in the apartment next to the veteran for nearly 10 years. Martinez remembered Weaver as a quiet, troubled tenant who had gradually filled his modest living space with an ever-growing collection of military artifacts. But she also remembered that in the weeks before his death, Weaver had become increasingly agitated and had made several cryptic comments about needing to make things right and tell the truth about what happened over there. Martinez had assumed that Weaver was simply experiencing the kind of end-of-life reflection that often affects people facing terminal illness. But she also remembered that Weaver had spent considerable time during his final weeks writing what appeared to be letters or documents that he never mailed or shared with anyone. After Weaver's death, these papers had been boxed up with his other personal effects and stored in Martinez's garage, where they had remained undisturbed for nearly 2 decades, when James explained his connection to Robert and his investigation. Into the helmet's provenance, Martinez graciously allowed him to examine the boxes of Weaver's papers that she had preserved. Among the routine correspondence and business documents, James found what he had been searching for: a detailed, handwritten account of the patrol during which Robert had disappeared, including information that had never appeared in any official report. Weaver's account confirmed many of the details that James had pieced together from his conversations with surviving veterans, but it also revealed crucial information that no one else had possessed. According to his written confession, Weaver had indeed returned to the contact site the day after the firefight, where he had found evidence that Robert had survived the initial engagement, but had been captured by North Vietnamese forces. Rather than reporting this discovery to his superiors, Weaver had made the calculated decision to remove Robert's helmet and other personal effects, believing that their recovery would support the official conclusion that Robert had been killed. In action. The confession revealed that Weaver had been motivated not by simple greed or opportunism, but by a misguided attempt to spare Robert's family the anguish of knowing that he might be suffering in enemy captivity. In the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, when prisoner releases and remains repatriation were highly politicized and uncertain, Weaver had convinced himself that allowing Robert's family to believe he had died quickly in combat was more merciful than revealing evidence that he might be enduring years of imprisonment and torture. But Weaver's confession also revealed that his decision had haunted him for the remainder of his life. As years passed and prisoner exchanges failed to include Robert's name, Weaver had gradually realized that his silence might have deprived Robert of opportunities for rescue or repatriation. The guilt over his decision had contributed to his isolation and his obsessive collecting of military memorabilia, as he surrounded himself with artifacts that reminded him daily of the war he had never truly left behind. The discovery of Weaver's confession provided James with the answers he had sought for 30 years, but it also presented him with new and painful questions about what might have been possible if the truth had been revealed decades earlier. He immediately contacted military officials and provided them with copies of the confession, demanding that they reopen Robert's case and investigate the possibility that he might have survived in captivity longer than previously believed. The military's response was cautious but genuine. Officials acknowledged that Weaver's confession represented significant new evidence that warranted investigation, and they agreed to review Robert's case in light of this information. However, they also cautioned James that the passage of 3 decades had made it extremely unlikely that Robert could still be alive, and that even if his capture had been confirmed at the time, the chaotic conditions in Southeast Asia following the American withdrawal might have made his rescue impossible. But for James, the value of Weaver's confession lay not in the false hope that Robert might still be alive, but in the closure that came from finally understanding what had happened. To him, the knowledge that his brother had survived the initial firefight, that he had not died alone and abandoned in the jungle, provided a measure of comfort that had been missing from his life for 3 decades. Even the possibility that Robert had spent his final months or years in captivity was preferable to the complete absence of information that had tormented his family for so long. James's discovery also had broader implications for other families, struggling with similar questions about missing servicemen. His case demonstrated the importance of preserving and investigating seemingly insignificant artifacts and testimonies that might contain crucial information about the fate of missing personnel. Military officials acknowledged that Weaver's confession had provided valuable insights into the way that battlefield recoveries had been conducted and documented during the Vietnam era, information that might be applicable to other unsolved cases. The investigation into Robert's case, reinvigorated by the discovery of his helmet and Weaver's confession, eventually led to a renewed effort to locate and recover his remains. Military teams returned to the area where he had disappeared, using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques to search for evidence of his presence. While these efforts did not immediately locate Robert's remains, they did recover additional artifacts from the 1971 firefight, including equipment and personal effects that helped confirm the accuracy of Weaver's account. As James worked with military investigators to piece together the final chapters of Robert's story, he also began the process of emotional healing that had been impossible while his brother's fate remained completely unknown. He organized a memorial service for Robert, attended by surviving members of his unit who shared their memories of a young soldier who had been trying to make sense of an incomprehensible war. The ceremony provided an opportunity for his former comrades to express regrets and acknowledgments that had been suppressed for decades, and it offered James a chance to honor his brother's memory in a way that had been impossible while he remained simply a name on a list of the missing. The memorial service also served as a forum for broader discussions about the lasting impact of the Vietnam War on the families of missing servicemen. James's story resonated with other families who had spent decades searching for answers, and his success in uncovering new evidence inspired renewed efforts to investigate other unsolved cases. His experience demonstrated that even seemingly minor discoveries, like a helmet at a yard sale, could provide crucial breakthroughs in cases that had been dormant for decades. For James personally, the resolution of Robert's case marked the end of a 30-year journey that had shaped his entire adult life. The knowledge that his brother had not simply vanished without a trace, that someone had known more about his fate than they had revealed, provided the closure that had eluded his family for so long. While he grieved for the wasted years when the truth had been hidden, he also found peace in the understanding that Robert's story had finally been told, and that his sacrifice had been properly acknowledged and honored. The helmet that had started his journey now sits in a place of honor in James's home, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a tangible connection to his brother's memory and the truth about his fate. The inscription, "Make war, not love," serves as a reminder of the complex realities that young soldiers faced in Vietnam, the moral ambiguities and impossible choices that shaped their experiences and their memories. For James, those 4 words represent not cynicism or despair, but his brother's determination to find meaning and purpose even in the darkest circumstances. The broader implications of James's discovery continue to resonate within the military community and among families of missing servicemen. His case has prompted military officials to re-examine their procedures for investigating and documenting battlefield recoveries, and to consider the importance of following up on seemingly minor leads that might provide crucial information about the fate of missing personnel. The discovery has also highlighted the value of preserving and sharing information about military artifacts and memorabilia. which might contain important clues about unsolved cases. James's story serves as a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of never abandoning hope, even when official channels prove inadequate or unresponsive. His 30-year search for answers demonstrates that families of missing servicemen possess unique motivations and capabilities that can complement and enhance official investigations. The emotional investment that drives such searches, while sometimes overwhelming, can also provide the sustained commitment necessary to pursue leads and investigate possibilities that might otherwise be overlooked or abandoned. The resolution of Robert's case also provides important lessons about the complex legacy of the Vietnam War and the ways that individual decisions made during wartime can have lasting consequences for multiple generations. Thomas Weaver's choice to conceal evidence about Robert's capture, while motivated by what he believed to be compassionate intentions, ultimately prolonged the suffering of Robert's family and deprived them of the closure they needed to process their grief and move forward with their lives. As James reflects on his journey, from the initial shock of finding Robert's helmet to the final resolution of his case, he recognizes that the process of uncovering the truth was almost as important as the truth itself. The investigation required him to develop new skills, forge relationships with strangers who shared his commitment to finding answers, and navigate complex bureaucratic and emotional challenges that tested his resilience and determination. The personal growth that resulted from this journey has provided him with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that extends far beyond the specific resolution of Robert's case. James's experience has also deepened his understanding of the broader community of families affected by the Vietnam War, and he has become an advocate for other families struggling with similar questions about missing loved ones. He regularly speaks at veteran organization meetings and family support groups, sharing his story and encouraging others to persist in their searches for answers. His message emphasizes that every case is unique, that new evidence can emerge decades after initial investigations have been concluded, and that the passage of time should not be accepted as a reason to abandon hope for resolution. The helmet that brought James's search to its conclusion now represents more than just a piece of military equipment or a family heirloom. It serves as a symbol of the thousands of American servicemen who remain unaccounted for from the Vietnam War, and of the families who continue to search for answers about their fate. James's success in uncovering the truth about Robert's disappearance provides hope and inspiration for those families, demonstrating that persistence and determination can sometimes achieve what official investigations could not. In the quiet moments when James examines the helmet and reads the faded inscription that his brother wrote more than half a century ago, he feels a connection that transcends the decades of separation and uncertainty. The young man who wrote those words was struggling to make sense of a war that challenged everything he believed about justice, morality, and human nature. His message represents not a rejection of love or peace, but an acknowledgement that sometimes the path to those ideals requires individuals to engage with harsh realities that test their courage and conviction. For James, the final chapter of Robert's story is not defined by the circumstances of his disappearance or the years of uncertainty that followed, but by the love and determination that sustained his family's search for truth. The discovery of his helmet at a suburban yard sale was remarkable, not because of its improbability, but because it represented the culmination of decades of hope and persistence that refused to accept that some stories are destined to remain unfinished. In finding Robert's helmet, James found not just answers about his brother's fate, but confirmation that love and loyalty can endure across any distance of time or space, and that the search for truth is itself a form of honor that gives meaning to sacrifice and loss.